Yeah, I think that that's real important, particularly the last point John made about team approach. Everyone has different disciplines. The valuation becomes important because that sets expectations in the event of a sale as to what can be expected. Also for retirement planning, how much can the cash or how much can the company distribute out over time, and gift planning as well. You need to have an appraisal because that's what the IRS typically requires if you're going to be doing some gift planning. If you're looking to sell, investment bankers such as John and John's firm, you know, they're invaluable because it is an emotional issue for a business owner, and it's a tremendous amount of work too to take a company, prepare it for sale and get it through the sale process. It's not just a matter of finding a company that's willing to buy. It's, you know, bringing those two together, brokering the deal, and getting and working through all the issues that come up in an M&A transaction. So that's a critical discipline. For lawyers, you know, we see clients at all stages of development. So, you know, we have startup companies, we have companies that are in growth stages, and we have family-owned businesses where the owner or the founder has gotten to the point where they're considering, you know, what's the next step. Maybe they're approaching retirement age. You know, so there's decisions to be made, and starting early is critical because there's a lot of planning that needs to be in place. John touched on a number of issues in terms of cleaning the books and records of the company up, trying to tackle financial issues, management issues. What you do want to do with succession planning is really ask the question, how can this business run without the owner being involved in the day-to-day operations? And that's important for a number of reasons. First off is what happens if the owner had an unexpected death or disability so they can't work in the business anymore? I mean, what's going to happen the next day? So that's a conversation that we have with our clients. And, you know, how do you plan for that sort of thing? You know, we don't want the company to have a tremendous loss in value because it can't do sales anymore. So if you had an owner that was the main salesperson, who's going to take over the sales responsibility? If you had an owner that was basically the chief operating officer, who's going to take over the operations the next day? So you need to begin to get into that dialogue and think about who's going to play those roles. Within the company, are there individuals that can serve those roles? Or do you need to look outside the company? So it's a human resources issue, but it's something that needs to be discussed. So that's the death and disability piece of this. And what we would recommend there is that you put together you think through what's going to happen, you know, the first week, the first month, the first 6 months in the event of a sudden death or disability, and kind of map out who's going to play what role. Another aspect of that is, should you have a board of advisors or some kind of board of directors that can really help oversee that process? And I think it's important to have a board, at least a board of advisors, meet quarterly with a business owner so that they understand the business and they can help advise the owner as to how to tackle long-term planning. And, you know, there might be issues with, you know, staffing issues, having the right people in the right place. But if you get the right kind of counseling, you know, maybe it's, you know, people that are retired or currently in business that have a lot of business experience, and they could really serve as a valuable sounding board in terms of helping the owner figure out issues. But if that board also serves as a nice transition vehicle for a new person that has to step in, because that board's going to have a wealth of information about these strategic level decisions and how to transition the new CEO, let's say, of the company in the event someone has to step in. I'm on actually slide 2 of my presentation. Succession planning, really what is it? There's business goals, family goals, and long-range strategic planning, all with the idea of how to preserve the business and maximize the business value. The business goals are basically, you know, how do we make sure that there's going to be enough cash to run the business, and how do we make sure that we have the right management team in place? I think from the family goal side is if the owner putting aside for a minute the sale of the company, which I think is a separate discussion, but if the owner is thinking about retiring and keeping the business, maybe they're going to have family members, son or daughter, run the business. Maybe there's key employees that can step right into those roles. The owner, when he or she makes that decision, needs to think about what are the retirement planning needs. So that's where you might get a financial advisor involved. But there's some tension there between the cash needs of the business and also the cash needs of the retiring owner. So, what do those cash distributions look like? Are they deferred compensation? Or do you consider a sale of the business to a key employee or a family member, and maybe those distributions look like purchase price? So there's that analysis that has to be done as to what can the company bear to distribute during retirement, and if it looks like there is too much tension there, meaning that the company can't distribute enough to fund the retirement, then you're probably looking at a sale. Next slide, operations and long-term planning. Again, thinking about how do we replace the owner if the owner's involved in the business, heavily involved, which is typically the case with the founder. There could be lines of credit that are involved where there's personal guarantees. The owner could have very strong customer and vendor relationships, could be heavily involved in sales. Certainly they're probably involved in strategic planning for the business. So identifying individuals to play those roles is critical. Again, thinking about what happens if someone had to step in immediately, there's the whole issue about, 6 months from now, the market may have changed, or, in terms of product sales, competition has changed, the industry changed. You need to have someone thinking in terms of strategic planning to be able to tackle those issues and to figure out the way forward with the company. So it becomes important that, today, if you have an owner that's thinking about retirement in the not too distant future, maybe 5 or 10 years out, who are they grooming to play that role? And what kind of management team are they building in order to take the company to the next level? Because John had touched on this already, even if they're not going to sell the business, or if they're not going to live off the business during the retirement, but they're planning a sale, strategic buyers, private equity buyers, they don't necessarily want to see a business where the owner is so involved that it can't run by itself. So having a management team in place that's competent and very good becomes definitely a value add to the business. Slide 4 is, the owner and family requirements. Touched on retirement needs of owner and spouse. Other family members, employment. Do we have family members that are involved in the business? If we do, employment is probably an important part of the family dynamic, because this business was created by the parents, and now one or more of the kids are working there. Maybe they're an officer, maybe they're running the business. So that becomes an important consideration when planning the way forward. What about non-participating family members? Maybe we have 1 or 2 siblings that are not participating in the business. What are their concerns or considerations? They may be looking at this from an inheritance standpoint, or perhaps they already own some equity and they're getting distributions. So when we're thinking about how to plan this forward, there's a number of dynamics that come into place. And you can kind of see that this gets a little bit into estate planning. Similar considerations play out here as they do in estate planning in terms of how are we taking care of the family. It's a lot more complicated when you have the family business, however, because there's really more individuals involved in the outcome. In terms of estate planning for an owner of a business, we need to provide for the ownership of the business in the estate plan. So what we typically do or recommend, if there's a first marriage, in the event of the death of the owner, we would recommend that the estate plan be structured so that it goes to the surviving spouse. In second marriages, that's probably not the case, but again, it's what the owner wants. But in second marriages, it probably makes sense to have the ownership and the control of the business go in favor of the kids from the first marriage, and then make separate provision for the surviving spouse. But that's a discussion that we have as part of the estate plan for the owner. Okay, in terms of operational issues, this is the next slide, 5. We think it's important as part of the succession plan. So when I say succession plan, there's a number of these issues we're running through, but it helps to actually reduce some of these ideas into writing and make procedures. So one of those is that if you have family members involved in the business, it may help to define roles and expectations for those family members, because what you don't want to have is conflicts that could arise, whether it's sibling rivalry or disagreements with dividend policies or whatever, strategic decisions. So having those roles defined, I think, is a way to minimize to the extent you can potential disputes among the family. Again, it's a family, so people are going to, siblings are going to disagree, but you want to run it like a business too. It's not, a business has to run logically, rationally. You have to make decisions based on good business sense. Family decisions don't always get made that way, as we all know. They're more emotional. So the two don't really mesh sometimes all that well. But in terms of when family members are in the business, they need to be thinking from a business standpoint. So defining those roles and expectations, I think, is important. I mean, and of course, it's going to be fluid because roles are going to change over time. And so you need to think about what kind of procedures would make sense to evolve with that process. I mentioned establishing a board already. As far as key employees go, they're going to be really the backbone of the operation, right? I mean, a successful business always has key employees. So, what's the issue from the owner's standpoint is you want to make sure you keep them, right? Particularly if the owner's going to retire and retain the business during his retirement, you need to have those key employees there because they're going to be invaluable to make sure the business runs the way it's supposed to. So that's part of building your management team. So we talk about that with our clients as well in trying to figure out how to structure a compensation arrangement for key employees that's going to retain them and properly reward them. That may look like, certainly it's going to look like there's going to be an employment agreement. There's going to be non-competition, non-solicitation provisions in there because we don't want our trade secrets to go out the window if the employee decides to leave. So we're going to put contractual restrictions in that way. There may be a bonus plan that makes sense. We have to figure out for the key employees what's the best motivator for them, and it might be cash at the end of the day. So if you put performance goals in place that, maybe it's based on revenue growth or profitability, and the key employees share in the uptick with, hitting those metrics. It maybe look like some kind of stock option plan or equity incentive plan where they're actually participating in owners. It could be phantom stock. But the idea is that you want to align their interests with the owner's interest so that they would participate in the success of the business. And also, you need to have the golden handcuff provision, which is you want to make sure some of this reward is deferred and doesn't vest until they reach retirement age. So that's another piece because we want to make sure they stay there. There's a little bit of a balancing act there in terms of what the vesting schedule is going to be and what's going to be a good motivator for the key employees. Okay, for the owner's retirement, oftentimes, as John talked about, sale makes the most sense, right? Because you can exit in a very up market. It's the best of times right now to sell. And if there is a market for the business and there's a buyer out there to be found, then it probably makes sense to pursue a sales strategy because sales typically are, if you can get the price, are the least risky to the owner because they take a lot of cash off the table at closing, right? The bulk of the purchase price usually is paid at closing, and the balance is paid over time. Maybe it's a 3, 5, 10-year note, whatever the case might be. But they're taking most of it off the table. If they're retiring, then they still have all their eggs in the basket, right? The business is still there, and there could be a downturn. So their retirement funding could be in jeopardy. If they do a sale to family members or key employees, there's a similar risk, right? Because their family members and key employees don't have a bunch of cash to give them on a sale. So it's going to get paid out over time. It's going to be funded by the business. Not that that's a bad idea, I mean, because that might be a good way to go, but, making sure you have that whole management structure in place and you have a visionary CEO, someone that's been groomed, and someone that can carry the business through the next decade or so and beyond, that becomes very important for the financial security of the owner if they're going to do that kind of a transaction. Okay. The next slide is slide 7. Kind of just touched on this already, so we can skip that one. Okay, slide 8, the written succession plan. Again, I've outlined here, there's 5 bullet points. These are 5 items that we like to reduce to writing in one fashion or another because it makes sense to. So the written procedures in the event of unexpected death or disability, again, that's just laying out so everyone knows here's what's to happen if the owner gets hit by a bus, right? Here, this person's taking over sales, this person's going to be the CEO. Maybe that's integrated with the board of advisors, so the board of advisors take an immediately larger role to help in a transition. Maybe there's a search that takes place to locate a replacement CEO. Whatever the case might be, whatever makes sense for that business, we recommend that all be laid out in a process. Because what happens there in the event of anyone's untimely death or disability that renders them unable to perform any further, it's an emotional event for the family. So the family might not be in a very good decision-making position at that point emotionally. So to have that all laid out, I think, is very helpful, and specifically to give assignments and tasks and responsibilities to designated individuals, family members or not, they could just be key employees or advisors, I think is important and very helpful. Again, I mentioned employment agreements, non-competes, bonus plans, that for key employees. If there's more than one owner, what do you need to have? You need to have a buy-sell agreement, right? Because usually co-owners or owners of shareholders of a business don't want to be in partnership with the family members of the other owner, right? So if something happens like a death, disability, some triggering event, that normally, or it should kick in options or mandatory requirements to purchase the deceased or disabled shareholder out. So the terms of that need to be spelled out. And I'll actually have a slide coming up on that. I'll talk in a little more detail. If there's going to need to be a successor, whether it's the CEO or chief operating officer or head of sales, there should be some kind of plan in place to locate that person. Again, this is if there's an unexpected death or disability, and we haven't already undertaken that process. And I mentioned already defining the roles for family members. The next slide, number 9, the buy-sell agreement. I mean, I'm sure you're all familiar with these. The key provisions here are that upon a triggering event, death, disability, retirement, perhaps bankruptcy, there is a buyout in favor of the non-terminating shareholder or non-deceased. Usually that's based on appraised fair market value, so that's where an appraisal comes into place. It doesn't have to be. It could be something less than that, as long as it's based on what third parties normally would agree to in those types of agreements. So you generally can't get too far from that. Transfer restrictions, we want to make sure shareholders aren't transferring to third parties or family members or whoever else. And financing the purchase, I mean, if upon death, if we have insurable shareholders, then we could have life insurance to help fund a buyout. But if it's retirement or disability, then we have to think about funding the retirement some other way, and it usually looks like a note that's 4 or 5 years, sometimes longer, to buy out the disabled or retiring shareholder. Oh, and finally, the last slide I have is estate and gift tax planning. So when we have clients with businesses that have substantial value, something in the excess of $10 million, we get into the discussions about what kind of estate and gift tax planning do you want to do, with the idea that we can take advantage of the lifetime exemption amount, which is currently $5,340,000 per person. For a married couple, it's double that, $10,680,000. So the idea is that we can make gifts up to that amount without having to pay any gift tax or estate tax. And there's really two drivers or levers that we try to invoke when doing gift tax planning. One is the valuation discounts that Jason talked about. So that might look like using a family limited partnership or some other mechanism to get a valuation discount, so we can actually make gifts at less than what they really are worth, so to speak. Not that there's anything inappropriate with a valuation discount, but it's a way to leverage the valuation principles that are allowed. And the other is to do what are called GRATs, grant or retained annuity trusts, or intentionally defective grant or trusts, which allow us to make gifts, really net gifts, because there's payments that are required to be made back to the grantor. And then the discount plus all the future appreciation is really what's being levered, so that as the business grows, we're moving a lot of that appreciation out of the owner's future taxable estate, and hopefully putting them in a better estate tax position. Okay, I think that's enough because we're really close to 9:30. Well, appreciate everyone coming. Hope you enjoyed it, and have a great day. Stay warm.